I can say, having been around composers for many, many years, that in my experience, composers write what they want to hear.
Welcome back to Atlanta Music Critic. I am William Ford, and today I have a very special guest. Eliza Garth has built a distinguished career as a pianist, known for her fearless exploration of contemporary music and her deep commitment to new voices in the repertoire. Over the years, she has premiered and championed works by a remarkable range of composers, helping bring challenging and imaginative music to the concert stage. Her newest recording, By the River, takes a different path, drawing inspiration from hymn tunes and spiritual melodies that have traveled from church to concert hall. The album weaves together works written for her with music by Brahms and others, creating a program that is both reflective and deeply personal. At the heart of the project is a work by her late husband, composer David Froome, to whom the recording is dedicated. In this conversation, we explore the ideas behind the album, the role of memory and melody, and how a performer shapes music that moves between tradition and innovation. We also reflect on her long journey as an interpreter of contemporary music and what continues to inspire her work today. I'm delighted to welcome pianist Eliza Garth to Atlanta Music Critic. Thank you for listening and for supporting classical music. What was it like for you growing up in Tampa?
Very interesting, cross-cultural city, and always has been. And when I was growing up there, of course, there was the very vibrant Hispanic community centered around Ybor City in a section of Tampa. And then there were the sort of Old South Southerners who had, been there, legacies who'd been there for generations. There was a substantial black population. When I was small, very much segregated, I remember very tail end of Jim Crow laws in Tampa. And then people like my parents who had come to make their lives there. But I was always kind of aware of the racial divisions there at that time. Interestingly, also when I was a very young kid, a man became the mayor of Tampa who really was ready to work hard to really see the end of Jim Crow and to, create more progressive life there, which for the time I think was pretty remarkable. But he was my parents knew him, they supported him. It was a very interesting blend of cultures. I know my parents adored, for example, in Ybor City, there were some absolutely fantastic restaurants and nightclubs and a vibrant music scene. And my parents were, at that point in their lives, used to go there for date night, enjoy the food and the culture. So, it different from some southern cities and rather the same in other ways.
And what about musically? What was it like musically?
Musically, I started off with a neighborhood piano teacher who gave me very good instruction. Tampa did have a cultural life, and they had a community orchestra that during my childhood grew into a more professional orchestra. The man who was the music director at CBS took it on as a kind of, side gig and started to build it into really an orchestra that could stand on its own among other professional orchestras. And my parents became very involved in trying to help that succeed. The conductor's name was Alfredo Antonini, and I was thinking of him the other night because he was the music director for the Jacqueline Kennedy tours of the White House. That was a CBS production he conducted. That was in the days when networks had orchestras. Contemporaneous with that, the University of South Florida was founded, and they were interested in building an excellent music program And they brought in a pianist for their faculty who himself had a very interesting background. They were interested in attracting people to come and build a quality music school. And so I was showing signs of musical ability, and my mother got in touch with him and asked whether he would hear me. And I was fortunate to work with him all through high school. It was a very fruitful relationship.
Do you remember the first time that you made contact with the piano and you said to yourself, this may be something here for me?
I think as a small child that happened, because from time to time, because of my parents' connection with the local symphony, they would entertain guest artists. So I heard professional playing from an early age. When I got old enough, it was a great thrill, a big deal to be taken to some of the concerts. And I just adored the sound of the instrument. And the other thing is, both of my parents were great, what today you would call audiophiles. There wasn't such a thing in those days, but they had an enormous collection of LP recordings. And my father especially loved to play Rachmaninoff concertos full blast. And I think for them too, there were, to just have the house vibrating with these compositions was just a real joy to them. To me too, it was thrilling to hear and then see an artist actually do that, and I was very drawn to it.
So you started out with the teacher from the university, and then where did you progress to?
After high school, I went to Connecticut College. And, my teacher from high school felt strongly that a liberal arts education was really important for a young musician. His attitude was, you can go to music school later, but a liberal arts college with a strong music department is really what I recommend. And I graduated young. I graduated a year early, and I'm a September baby, so I was pretty young going off to college. And I worked with a wonderful pianist there. And then from there went to Boston University. And I transferred, actually, because after 2 years in the liberal arts, I had exhausted all of the requirements for the major. And when I went to the dean and said, could you give me permission to take some more music courses for junior and senior year, she said, maybe you should be thinking about a music school. So I went up to Boston University and finished my undergraduate degree there. And then from there went to Juilliard, moved from Boston down to New York, and worked with Abby Simon for a number of years.
And then what did you want to do in your career, if you can remember what your thoughts were at that time? When you got out of Juilliard, what did you think you were going to do? What did you want to do?
Actually, when I went to Juilliard, I went as a somewhat older student. I wasn't an undergraduate. And I had seen, some colleagues with a very narrowly defined idea of what they wanted, a touring concerto artist or touring recital artist. And of course, I was intrigued by those things, and I had some opportunities to do that kind of work. But going into Juilliard, I really thought about what my hopes were in terms of a professional life. And what I was hoping for was, first of all, really interesting work, great colleagues, and a chance to feel like I was really making a contribution. And beyond that, I would be open-minded about it and see, because I had seen enough of how you can plan and plan in the music field, and at a certain point it works out or it doesn't. And so I thought, well, I also started being in New York, going to concerts and really thinking about the artists that I admired most. and just thinking about their values were, the kind of work they were doing. Then alongside that, I had always had teachers who believed strongly that in order to be a really fully functioning artist, one had to be tuned into what one's contemporaries were doing, compositionally speaking. Each of them in his own time, you know. The man I worked with in Boston had played a premiere of the Bartók Third Concerto in Hungary many years before. My high school teacher, the first really serious teacher I had premiered a piano concerto by David Crayenbuhl. But David Crayenbuhl was prominent in the mid-20th century. I believe he was a pupil of Hindemith. And he may be best known as a collaborator with Francis Clark and the Sumi Burchard Publishing in developing teaching materials for children. He made a real mark there. He was a major composer, and my high school teacher had toured Europe playing his piano concerto. So I got to hear my teachers speaking very excitedly about how great it was, you know, to be the first to play these works and how important it was to them. So that was in my hard wiring. And to get back to your question, right around the time, last semester at Juilliard, I had started going to concerts that were sponsored by Columbia University for their graduate students to present new music. And I had gotten interested. They had hired me a couple of times to play new works for them. And around that same time, several pianists in the New York area who had been doing a lot of the new music playing moved on for whatever reason, you know, career change or, you know, a couple of cases it was health reasons. As I was departing Juilliard, suddenly this opened up. It was like, for someone who was interested in that work, there were a lot of opportunities. And coming out of Juilliard, I was as busy as I could be. I had a pile of scores sitting on the piano, and I felt so fortunate. And I also got my wish because the other musicians in the new music community in New York, even now, are such wonderful colleagues. There's really an esprit de corps in which everybody's pulling the wagon in the same direction. You know, we want to get this piece to work. We want to do this, make it happen, get to know the composer. It's very, very rewarding work. I mean, that was really how I started. It grew from there.
You obviously were maturing professionally during a time when music was going through sort of a transition. Some people would say that was not a great time for music, that some of the music being developed was being developed for colleagues as opposed to general audiences. What's your take on that?
It could be true in some cases. You know, some people became kind of absorbed in their own creative world with colleagues. What I always have said to audiences when I'm presenting a new work is that the 20th and 21st centuries it's a big wide world. You know, for a while there was a lot of attention on, you know, a certain school of composing, but that doesn't mean there weren't other, you know, wonderful things being written. As far as that particular school that you're referring to, I mean, I did a lot of work with those composers and, you know, found very engrossing. And I think what I always tried to bring to that music was the same sensibility I would have brought to a Chopin scherzo or a Beethoven sonata. I think for some people, for some performers, there was a division between the newer music and the older music. Certainly not for all of the performers, but I would hear that sometimes in school. That's another animal altogether. The other thing that I've always encouraged audiences to do is when you encounter a language that is really unfamiliar to you and you're finding it a little hard to grapple with it, to listen to it a few times, because it's a little bit like taking a transatlantic flight and landing in a country where you don't speak the language. At first, you get off the plane, you're tired, you're caffeine deprived, and the language is alienating. And then the second day you're there, you start to hear the cadences of the language. By a week, you're starting to hear individual words that you get. And so, you don't just take in a language all at once. And I mean, there were some of those compositional languages that could be forbidding for some people. I think that certain composers really managed to synthesize those compositional techniques with an earlier, almost romantic sensibility, and that was what really drew me to Donald Martino's music. I really felt like he had found a way to express his own very expressive sensibility in this intellectually very demanding language. And there was a real excitement in that, a real kind of tension and excitement in it. And so I think it's like with it's the same with some types of literature, where you don't just get it the first time you read it. You have to spend a little time with it and really allow it to come to you before you decide whether you think it's good or not. I can say, having been around composers for many, many years, that in my experience, composers write what they want to hear. It may be that some composers in the mid-20th century were writing, according to formulas that, they felt were the right formulas. But that was not true for everybody, and certainly the many composers that I've known were writing what they wanted to hear. And I think if an audience understands that, it can begin to bridge that gap. I was thinking about that single performance thing and reminded of when William Masellos, the pianist, played the premiere of the Copland Fantasy, which is a big piece. And it came out of his, a lot of people don't realize it, but Copland earlier in his career wrote quite angular, more experimental music than what we often associate with him. And the Piano Fantasy is a big, gnarly work. And Masellos was giving the premiere of it. And so the whole program, it was done at the Juilliard School. The whole program, the first half was the Copland Fantasy, then there was intermission, and then the second half was the Copland Fantasy. I think that demonstrates such commitment on Masellos's part that he really wanted to give the piece an introduction. And of course, that would have been a pretty sophisticated audience. So, sophisticated in the sense of people who were used to hearing newer works. And I often think it's too bad we don't do that more often.
And of course, there are all kinds of other pressures that mitigate against that happening. Can you fill the seats? Can you afford to do it? And all of those practical realities.
Right. And in New York City, there's an avid new music audience who would totally go for that. It wouldn't sell in a lot of places.
Right.
People would expect to hear, a more conventional program.
Now, your late husband was a composer.
Yes.
Did you two work collaboratively with regard to you introducing his pieces or even consulting on writing them?
Not so much consulting on writing them. Although once it was written, if there was something that I found really just didn't suit my hands, he was certainly open. He was a fine pianist himself. So he was open to, playing around with a passage if I found that for me it was not realistic. But we did collaborate a number of times. Of course, I was always tuned in to wanting to, I mean, as flattering as it would have been to be his muse, I thought it was really important for me not to be the only pianist who played his music. And he had many performances by really fine pianists, I'm glad to say. Once the piece was written and I had a chance to learn it, I would play for him, and he would, give me ideas. He might say, this isn't working quite the way I had hoped, because there's something you can do. Or occasionally he would say, well, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's kind of neat. So it was a very wonderful collaborative process. And of course, I did perform his music. I think I performed most of the works he wrote that included piano.
Did he compose at the keyboard?
Yes.
Did you ever kibitz and say, oh, no, 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 no?
No, I was hands off. And he was hands off about my practicing too. And he would not come into the practice room and say, no, you're, we kind of had an understanding that we needed a chance to, make mistakes and work on things and not feel like we were being critiqued, in the process.
You obviously have built a wonderful career on some of the innovative music of mid last century to modern day. And yet your new album, do you think it continues that tradition?
I do. I think it's fed by old traditions, the music on it. But I think a lot of newer music is. It's just that sometimes the language on the surface of it is something a little different from what people are accustomed to. So they may not recognize immediately that it is actually, it's not a break from the past, it's a continuation of what came before. And that's part of the reason why the Brahms is included there, is the Brahms sort of represents both. It was those chorale preludes were composed in 1897, so the 20th century was just on the horizon. It was the last thing Brahms ever wrote. And then Busoni, who was a huge Brahms admirer, came along and said, well, there are several of these that would work really nicely in the concert hall. So I see Busoni as kind of pulling the pieces into the 20th century. Of course, 4 out of the 5 selections on the recording were composed after 1970. And they do look back at older music. Yeah, the works that were written after 1970 and after do look back to earlier music because they draw on traditional hymnody. Those tunes are really the starting point for those composers to take and work with. And I often invoke Appalachian Spring, where Copeland took this just gorgeous old Shaker melody and made it into something new and different. It's a little bit the same process.
When I listened to the Brahms, by the way, I have to say I would not have recognized it as Brahms. It did begin to thin out sonically from some of that dense music that he wrote. And I don't know whether that was Brahms or whether that was Busoni or both. But it really, it sounded like it was moving into the 20th century.
It's more spare than what came before it.
Yes. And it's impressive.
I
Impressive.
think, yeah, they're wonderful pieces. And I think that, there are various ways you can approach them. When I was working on them, I listened to some recordings, and some pianists really wanted to take them towards the piano repertoire and really went for a more kind of virtuosic sound. My take on it was to also listen to the organ recordings, the recordings of the original, and to base an interpretation on taking that into account. To my ear, they're very stately. They're kind of introspective. This is Brahms at the end of his life, and the pieces are dedicated to Clara Schumann, who had died recently, and he was facing his own mortality at that point. So there is a somberness about them. At the same time, I think there's also a certain rapturous element, but it's not hurried. It's almost atmospheric what he does with those. In any case, I think they work that way, and then instinctively that was the approach I wanted to take with them.
Are there a lot of recordings of
There
that
are,
music on the
yes,
piano?
yes. I wouldn't say a lot, but there are some. Paul Jacobs, who was for many years the pianist for the New York Philharmonic and played a lot of contemporary music, also made a recording of them. And then there have been a few recordings since, but not many.
Can you talk about the film that you were involved with?
It actually started with one of the pieces on my album, the Frederick Tillis Spiritual Fantasy, because I spent a lot of time, lived for a number of years down in Maryland. I was teaching in a liberal arts college there, so I was kind of back and forth between Maryland and New York in those years. And during my time down there, I formed a really wonderful creative partnership with an Episcopal church down there, a small historic church. And the rector there was really interested in creating a vibrant cultural scene at the church. So I played a recital there at one point that included the Tillis. And of course, that piece is based on themes from Black spirituals. And as I sat down to play it, I was kind of struck by the idea of playing that music in that historic church, because that church had been built by enslaved people. It sort of stayed on my mind and, kind of grew there as I should say I knew also that the congregation there and the rector were aware of that history of slavery among old Episcopal churches in southern Maryland, and they were keen to sort of come to terms with that. So those two things came together in my mind, and I thought, this could make an interesting film. So the rector and I, started having conversations about it, and we brought in leaders from the local Black community, leaders from the Episcopal church there. It just grew from there, and we got a wonderful director, African American, who's from DC, who took a lot of interest in it and helped us shape it. So it's just had its first showing, and there'll be another showing this weekend. And then we're going to look into making it available to schools, civic groups, various, as a way to start conversations. Southern Maryland has a particular history in segregation and slavery, and it's been developed as I hope, a wonderful conversation starter for people. And I'm the executive director.
Was there a lesson that you learned out of all of this? Like, I'll never make another movie again, or...
Well, this is not a career change. Somebody asked, "Oh, what's your next movie?" And I said, No, this grew out of my music work, so I see this as a one-off. But I learned a lot about the day-to-day grind of Jim Crow and then the segregation and racism that followed it. Just the day, from the stories that people shared as part of interviews for the film, the day-to-day ways, and yet the people who were interviewed have had prosperous lives. And I asked one of the interview subjects about that. I said, "Aren't you awfully angry?" And his reply was, "No, because I knew they were wrong. My parents taught me they were wrong." So that was an eye opener for me.
Is there going to be a distribution plan for it? I mean, are you looking to put it on other platforms?
Yeah, we're looking into that next. It's kind of in its infancy right now, but so far the response to it has really been gratifying. The community down there, the first showing sold out, and the second one this weekend is sold out. And I've had inquiries from like the local Rotary Club who would like to present it at the library, and so there's been a lot of really nice feedback, and so we'll see how it's going to grow organically.
Really great meeting you.
Likewise, and thanks so much for the invitation.
You bet. You take care now.
All right, you too.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.
Hi, it's William again. One idea from this interview has really stayed with me. Eliza Garth compared encountering unfamiliar music to arriving in a country where you don't yet speak the language. You begin to understand it only after spending time listening. I also loved her reflections on the late Brahms chorale preludes, which she described as introspective works written as Brahms faced the end of his life. Thanks for watching this conversation with pianist Eliza Garth. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so more listeners can discover these discussions. And I'll see you next time on Atlanta Music Critic. And in the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe, become a patron at www.patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic, and join me on wford.substack.com.